Our guest on the podcast today is Mark McGivern, and Mark is a writer, a teacher, a musician as well, and has taught English in many different places, which we'll hear about in a moment, and also the author of Tolkien's Hidden Pictures, Anthroposophy and the Enchantment in Middle-earth. So we'll talk about that in a moment. But welcome to the podcast, Mark.
Oh, thanks, Mick. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. So I'd love to start with just a little bit of background for our listeners about who you are, maybe how you came into anthroposophy or to be involved in Waldorf education. That'd be great to start with.
Yeah, I had the good fortune of forming a good friendship with someone in university just when I was stepping out of my Catholic upbringing somewhat and kind of looking for my own kind of spiritual path. And yeah, my good friend Robert McKay, we've been friends for quite a while now still. And he introduced me to Steiner and I became quite interested in that. And then was a teacher for most of my younger life, in my 20s and 30s. I was lived in different countries and taught mostly English and traveled. I lived in Nicaragua for a year during the Sandinista Revolution and taught there. I lived in Japan, in a little town in Japan for a year and taught there in a big Honda factory. And then later on, yeah, worked in Toronto, where I was from. Again, as a teacher, I worked in a center for victims of torture, or for refugees who had made their way to Canada and had that kind of background. And then I lived in Dubai for 3 years and taught there in a kind of fairly multicultural setting in a way, but mostly had young Emirati men in the Dubai Men's College. Um, so I had a really interesting window into their lives and that part of the world. And then after that, I was trained as a Waldorf teacher in Toronto at the Rudolf Steiner College and began first day 9/11, which was an interesting experience to arrive at my much anticipated Waldorf training and at a very historical moment. And then worked as a Waldorf teacher in British Columbia in Nelson, BC, in Canada, which is around the area where I currently live in. And worked I was basically a middle school teacher. I started in grade 6, and then I did grade 6, 7, and 8, and then repeated grade 8, and then went down to grade 5 and repeated grade 6. And then uh, did a bit of teacher training after that, and worked in a high school project called Self Design High, which was a kind of Waldorf-inspired hybrid of online and in-person learning. Yeah, and just been involved in the Waldorf movement since in different ways. Recently, I wrote a course called Anthroposophy and Introduction for the Steiner College in Toronto, and another course called Voices of Experience that brought together experienced Waldorf educators into kind of like a workshop format. So it's a little bit like you're at their workshops. And now been involved recently in some teacher training. And yeah, that kind of brings me up to the present. I'm helping to start a Waldorf school here in Victoria in BC. And yeah, just doing some teacher training in Toronto as well. And also the other thing I'd say would be I'm a foundations mentor for a lot of teachers in training in the Toronto program to help them go through their foundations year as a mentor.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Wonderful. All right. Well, thank you. So maybe I'll sort of cut to the chase because I tend to waffle on a little bit sometimes. But the reason I got you on the podcast or heard about you initially was an article that you wrote for New View magazine, which I highly recommend for our viewers and listeners. It's a great magazine about this idea of decolonization or decolonizing the Waldorf curriculum. Could you maybe talk us through what that means, where that comes from, and your article, which was in a sense an argument against that?
Yeah, it's a big issue. It's sort of a the decolonization um, effort is a bit of a sub effort of a bigger effort, if you will, to bring what I would call critical social justice theory to anthroposophy and to its various practical applications. One of them being Waldorf education. Yeah, so it's a bigger issue. So decolonization is part of an effort to you could say, well, some of the language used is to modernize or upgrade the Waldorf curriculum so it's more relevant to our times, I suppose you could say. And certainly the Waldorf curriculum is something that is not written in stone. Steiner never necessarily meant it to be um, an immovable or unadaptable thing. However, at the same time that that's true, there's also an effort within, I would say, the critical social justice movement, sometimes referred to as woke. Um, there's a movement there to move the Waldorf curriculum in a direction that is that is that in a way it parts ways with the anthroposophical foundation of Waldorf education, and it does this um, under the guise of a kind of moral principle of justice. That if we really consistently moving forward in addressing social justice issues, then there's certain aspects of the Waldorf curriculum that need to change. Is the kind of argument, and one of them is the notion that we haven't paid enough. The Waldorf curriculum is too Western oriented, and therefore doesn't really look at the both the historical effects of colonization and the continuing after effects of that. It doesn't take them seriously or prioritize them, and therefore passes on to Waldorf students these sort of older historical assumptions that about Western culture that need to be changed. So decolonization is really it's really the substituting out of one set of cultural assumptions about Western culture and transporting them or transforming them, sorry, into um, or bringing a new set of cultural assumptions. Now, while the questioning of that is an important thing to do, like where are biases showing up in the Waldorf curriculum, the the next step in that, in terms of adopting a new set of cultural assumptions, is where the conversation really lies. What is this new set of cultural assumptions that is being used to redesign the Waldorf curriculum? And when we look at that closely, we see that the new set of assumptions comes out of this whole postmodern critical theory-based social justice theory and its critique of Western culture, its reimagining of the nature of racism and discrimination and gender. And that's where the conversation is, because from my point of view, many of the advocates of that point of view are I would say, misrepresenting anthroposophy, and they're also dismissing anthroposophy on certain grounds without having looked carefully at what anthroposophy brings to questions of social justice. So there's two things there: a dismissal on the basis of claims of racism and Eurocentrism, and there's the I would say, in my experience so far, the absolute complete ignoring of what anthroposophy does brings, particularly through social threefolding. So the work I've tried to do that's represented in that decolonization article, the work that I've been doing, been giving some talks and workshops at different Waldorf schools and with Waldorf teachers and training, is to actually do that. Let's look through the lens of threefolding at what anthroposophy does bring to questions of social injustice and social health. And the remarkable thing is that when you do that, you realize that um, what Steiner's bringing through there is what I call, and I mentioned this in the article, is that it's bringing a transformative vision, this idea that we can transform social power rather than revolutionizing it. So that's part of the I think the nature of the debate. I believe that the critical social justice way of thinking is a continuation of a sort of socialistic tradition of wanting to revolutionize social power. And what Steiner does is that he brings, and you could say that Steiner's point of view is also kind of revolutionary in that it's calling for fundamental change. But when we revolutionize power, we basically we don't transform the nature of power itself. We just put it in the hands of the group that we think is oppressed. And Steiner did a lot of work. We know the Russian Revolution was happening during his time, and he did a lot of work to unearth the materialistic thinking that was behind the social revolutions of his time. And he wanted to bring something new, which I look at it. I use the language of transforming the nature of social power. So that's kind of the conversation and the kind of work that I'm trying to do. And I think it's nicely encapsulated in that in this notion of the difference between revolutionizing social power and transforming social power. And it's beautifully encapsulated by the work of George Orwell. I think, we're all familiar with Animal Farm. Many people have had it on their high school curriculums or have read it, and it's this amazing picture of a revolution that happens. And yet the drama of the story is based on the idea that nothing transforms, that just putting power into different hands doesn't bring social health. And in fact, it could actually worsen the conditions of social health. So Steiner's insights around transforming social power really come through in his work on social threefolding. And we can begin, now that we're faced with this very um, strong and well articulated critical social justice perspective, we can begin now really comparing the vision of social health we find in social threefolding and and critique it against this other point of view. And I think we can make a lot of headway um, in the social threefolding movement when we do that. When we see that its utility as a framework for understanding the origin of social injustice in a very different way than critical social justice approach sees it. Does that
Okay.
make sense?
Yes, that's a wonderful erudite introduction to the whole to the whole thing. Thank you. Um, One question that came up as you were speaking was you mentioned the dismissal, this kind of dismissal of anthroposophy
Mhm.
as the ground, if you like, of Waldorf education. Is it also the case that there's a dismissal of the positive aspects of Western culture?
Yeah, that's something I take up in this article on decolonization too. It definitely um, emphasizes the idea that Western culture must be reimagined or put on a new foundation, and that what Western culture has brought is essentially negative to the world. And that's a pretty problematic picture, particularly for young kids who've grown up within that culture to have it represented to them as something that's fundamentally corrupt to the core. Um, I mean, and that may not be said directly, but if you look at some of the characteristic changes that are being brought or being suggested for the Waldorf curriculum, there's often um, uh, well, I'll give you a quick example that's used in one of Martin Rawson's essays on rethinking the Waldorf curriculum. Just to give you an example of how this thinking goes. Um, he suggests for a grade three approach to farming that the teacher would bring this picture of the settlers in North America. He's talking about the North American audience, but the settlers in early North America, the kind of approach they brought to farming versus the indigenous approach to farming. And it's very clear the way it's brought that the Western approach is bad and the indigenous approach is good. So there's a kind of inherent judgment being being called for that would guide teachers to how to decolonize their curriculum. Look at the Western ways as inherently oppressive, and look at indigenous ways as inherently unoppressive. And this is not looking, well, first of all, bringing that to grade three students in any shape or form, even if it's, adapted into kind of an imaginative form in some way. There's inherent judgment in it. So it's deeply problematic in many ways to characterize one culture as inherently corrupt, or that and present curriculum in such a way that it encourages students in their learning to see that the fundamentals of Western culture have to be revolutionized, you could say, because they're inherently inhuman or corrupt.
Okay. So could one of their arguments be that that Western culture has led to a lot of problems in that there are in the world now, and the indigenous cultures haven't? I mean, it's a difficult argument to make, but if you look at the history of England, where I live, for example, it's it's a country that's been able to, in a sense, dominate the much of the globe due to sea power and other things. Um, so yeah, I'm not sure exactly what my question is, but there could their argument be that so much negative has come from Western culture that we need to redress the balance. I'm just playing devil's advocate here for a moment.
Yeah, yeah. No, and I would agree with that. We actually have to transform Western culture, and that's the whole nature of anthroposophy. It's here to do, and offers us many ways to do that. The question is, um, how do you teach children in freedom to um, to reach their own conclusions about that? How do you help in your approach to uh, to develop the capacity for sound judgment and a moral conscience and a sense of social responsibility? So what you're focusing on in the Waldorf curriculum is capacities that later in life have a good foundation for them to act morally in the world. You're not trying to convince them of one point of view and ingrain that one point of view into them, um, which is part of the whole history of um, sort of after revolutions. Often, the education systems are redone so that the revolution is looked at in a glorious manner, right? Now, at the same time, we do have all kinds of uh, excuse me, assumptions about Western culture that need to be challenged. But the question really is, how do you do that with children? Well, Steiner's answer is that you build up their capacity for sound judgment. You don't bring judgment to them or pull on judgment before puberty. And once puberty arrives, you cultivate the sound judgment through a diversity of point of view. So I think it's a pretty sound approach. Um, and the other thing that Steiner said is that the teacher must never try to inculcate their own moral codes or perspectives into the child, because that robs them of their freedom later to come to their own moral point of view. So it's a fascinating debate. You know, it comes right down to the nature of do we have faith in that pedagogical approach, or do we do we use do we use a curriculum to inculcate one political point of view?
Yeah, and it's not just a pedagogical approach either. It's really um, the way I see it anyway, it's a true understanding of human development and child development. So, what is appropriate at what age in order for that freedom to develop, the freedom of thinking, the freedom of moral choice, etc., to
Yeah,
develop at the right time. It's the right thing at the right time that's so
yeah,
important.
exactly. And you know, over the years, I've gone to some DEI workshops offered by the Waldorf movement in North America and some conferences. And you know, I've heard some of the adaptations that people are that stu that teachers under the influence of decolonization are bringing. And you know, two of the more absurd ones was the suggestion by one of the one of the workshop leaders from Alma Partners, which is a consulting group in North America that's bringing this point of view to Waldorf schools, is that you know we substitute the the mythic character of Thor with Black Panther, which is a Marvel comic book hero from the 1950s or 60s. And even the notion that you could do that, or that that's a transferable thing, you know, just
Mm.
shows you that they have no understanding of why mythology is in the curriculum at all. Another in Vancouver recently, I heard that there was a teacher in grade two who substituted the saints theme, or the you know these this image in grade two of humans that are sort of imbued with goodness, and he this teacher brought in his own personal political heroes, and who he renamed it Saints to Heroes, and then brought in you know political figures from the States and other you know from the last number of years, and these were his personal political heroes. So he thought that an appropriate cultural or an appropriate curriculum adaptation. So the idea that that could even happen and not be questioned, and it just tells you the level of disconnection
Mm.
between uh, the, the curriculum as as these folks understand it, and the roots of where that curriculum came from, and that the curriculum is really designed for uh, to support child development. It's not there to for have the personal moral codes or preferences of the teacher to be inserted into it. So it's a real kind
Yeah.
of there's a real problem there that needs to be addressed. And that's what I try to do in the decolonization article is try to get into, you know, where does this thinking come from? How is it embedded in critical social justice theory to begin with? And then what does a Waldorf approach that's still based in anthroposophy bring to those issues? And that touches on, in a way, a sort of larger picture. I mean, these are, in a way, symptoms of a bigger problem. And some of these problems that I see is that in the anthroposophical movement, we don't have a well thought out social justice theory and practice. We have social threefolding, which is a picture of social health, but we haven't, in a way, filled out that picture with how does the social threefolding picture help us to understand the nature of social injustice in each of those realms, the rights realm, the cultural realm, the economic realm, because the picture of injustice and why injustice um, manifests in those different realms they're different. It's not just the lack of egalitarianism, which is the picture that critical social justice theory brings. Is the problem is there's not enough equality, and the answer is equality everywhere. And for me, that's a kind of low resolution picture. And what Steiner brought was like a higher resolution picture about the nature of what it takes to achieve social health, and this higher resolution picture of what injustice looks like in each of these different realms. And I would tag on to that. The ideal that governs each of those realms is also the key to solving the social injustice issues that arise in each of those realms. And that, for me, that's a higher resolution picture. And to say that egalitarianism is the only source of the problem and the only answer keeps us at a low resolution picture and doesn't really serve our eventual goal of social health. It fundamentally, this sort of low resolution picture, just to bring it back again to the transforming social power and revolutionizing it, the low resolution picture feeds into this idea that all we have to do is revolutionize social power, then we'll have egalitarianism and social injustice will disappear. Steiner's picture is you have to transform social power and then things will actually change. You'll have a high enough resolution picture of the activity in each realm to know how social injustice is arising in the cultural realm, how it's arising in the economic realm. And you can address it through the ideals of freedom and in the cultural realm and the idea of fraternity in the economic realm. That perspective will actually deal with how social injustice arises. And egalitarianism, Steiner warned about the notion that so the other thing that Steiner brings around uh, the idea of social injustice is that in those three realms of rights, culture, and economy, each with its own ideal, if one tries to if in the political realm we try to bring rights over into one of the other realms, we think, oh, we'll bring egalitarianism into the economic realm as the the history of revolutionary socialism essentially tries to bring. Steiner says that that sounds idealistic on the surface, but it'll actually, and this is I think one of his most brilliant insights, is that not only will it not address the source of injustice in the economic realm, it will aggravate it even further. It'll bring new problems, new social pathologies into that realm. And we saw this, and this is played out historically in the Bolshevik Revolution. Like within 10 years, the Bolshevik Revolution went from this incredible picture of workers' councils and factory committees and Soviets into a centralized police state in ways that was probably unimaginable to the Russian revolutionaries of that time. If they could look forward in 10 years and see that a social pathology took over that revolutionary impulse, I'm sure they would have been horrified at the end results. And Steiner brings us this insight that um, they tried to transform the economic life through rights and equality and not through fraternity. So it's a big conversation. And I think anthroposophy has a lot to bring to it that's being dismissed, mostly on the claim that it's Eurocentric, which I think is an easily disputed claim because I think the goal of anthroposophy is to transform Western culture, not to perpetuate its current state, right? And then on the claim of racism that Steiner that embedded in anthroposophy and in Steiner's outlook were racist ideas. So the low resolution is a problem there too in the anthroposophical movement. Not only do we not have a kind of really clear picture of the nature of social injustice and how to address it, we don't have a clear picture of Steiner's anthropology of race. It's a super. I'm not sure if you've delved into that question so much, but it's a very complicated picture. And given the climate of critical race theory, it's difficult to find the space to go into that picture of this complicated picture of the anthropology of race and get a real clear understanding of it. I think most anthroposophists don't have that. And it's one of the pieces of work I think we need to do is to bring that picture into a real clear, high resolution, and so we can see what the nature of that, because that claim of racism kind of destroys our trust in Steiner, right? That he brought all of this esoteric knowledge, but he wasn't able to overcome the racial biases of his culture and time. So initially it's like, well, maybe critical social justice theory will do that for us, you know. But I don't think it's a fair assessment. There's a number of things that Steiner said that are very easily interpreted as racism unless you bring it into the wider context of what he's bringing. So that's another, I think, piece of work that is in front of us.
Yeah, that one's very, very important because if that's the first thing that people encounter about Steiner or about anthroposophy, and you've got that background of critical race theory, or, which is sort of so alive in the culture at the moment, then it just turns you away from it, and you don't look any
Yeah,
deeper, and then it's all over. So I think
yeah,
that's a yeah. Someone I know locally, um, philosopher and teacher Robert Rose has done quite a bit of work on that as well. So maybe I could put you in touch with him too. Um,
yeah. There's been some really good work on it that's out there. I just think
yeah.
it's not disseminated or uh, a deeply held picture within the anthroposophical movement and within
Okay.
and for
Yes.
Waldorf teachers and Waldorf teacher training. Yeah,
Yeah. Yeah. That would be really important to bring it to the teacher training and communicate that more clearly. It's a deep study as well, though, isn't it? So it's not easily
yeah,
graspable. You can't put it in a sound bite.
yeah. And my one of my angst is that it's one of the basis one. It's very easy just to dismiss Steiner on that basis.
Yeah.
And that's the kind of place we're in now, where on that basis, people are saying, well, okay, we can leave Steiner behind us
Mm.
a bit and kind of go on in this in a new direction based on that. And without I would say an honest, real honest look at it. Um,
Yeah.
and so there's a lot hanging in the balance if we don't do that work.
Hmm.
Um, there's a real, what Martin Rawson would call a recalibration between Waldorf education and anthroposophy. And what I do is I counter his claim in this article and try to argue that we're not at the basis of recalibrating if unless what has brought is really clear in our minds. I would say what Martin is bringing is more of a low resolution picture, even though it's brought in, you know, a highly academic form that suggests, deep scholarship and deep thinking. Um, I'm not impressed with the level of scholarship that's being done around these questions. They're based on assumptions that I don't think are valid.
There's so much academic work out there that, and I've only read a little bit of Martin Rawson's work, so I can't talk too much about it. And but a lot of academic work where you can start to sense that actually, well, you have to kind of look at what's underneath this. What are the thoughts that are informing this? And it can be very complicated and articulate and well thought out in many ways, but the actual fundamental assumption at the bottom of it is hollow. And I wanted to
Yeah.
ask about that with critical race theory and those things. What is the underlying epistemological foundation of it? What is it based on? Where is it coming from? Is it from the beginnings of the Bolshevik Revolution, or is it before that? Do you have a sense, or do you know?
Well, my sense of it is that, in the 80s and 90s, the last century, uh, that this what we call postmodern thinking arose, and and sort of gave, let's call it leftist thinking or socialistic thinking, a new kind of a new basis upon which to rest. And then you could say the older or traditional approach to social justice, which was largely based on rights, like universalizing rights. So think of Martin Luther King and Stephen Biko and others. It's about having rights. And with the postmodern turn, that shifted to the cultural realm. Traditional socialism, so you had the universalizing of rights, but then with Marx and with Marxism, which was the thing that Steiner was concerned about, is that it brought the notion of rights into the economic realm. And he said that's problematic. You're going to have one of the three spheres dominating the other, and that'll create new problems, which I think historically has played out. So the way I understand what's happened is that having attempted to bring rights into the economic realm, and that basically being played out historically, the postmodern shift that happens at the late 20th century is bringing rights into the cultural realm. So where freedom is the basis of health in the cultural realm, there's an attempt to replace that with rights. So it's a new way of thinking, yet at the same time it's a repetition of the same problem that Steiner brought, his critique of socialism, a very, very extensive critique of socialism. Um, at his time, it's the same thing that's being done, but it's just a very unfamiliar set of ideas. It's like the clothing has all changed. But I think it's essentially the same thing, that we're not using freedom to look closely at the so it's the absence of freedom in the cultural realm that is the source of injustice there, not the absence of rights. And the more that we define it in terms of rights, the the more kind of chaos that's going to arise from that,
So
and
does
potentially,
that
yeah,
sorry to cut you off. Does that speak directly to education? Because education would be considered a part of the
yes,
cultural sphere, and
exactly,
so
yeah.
that's where freedom needs to exist. But it can't be. Are we talking freedom of the teacher to what are we talking about if we're like to bring it into a practical example? If we're talking about freedom in education, what are we talking about?
Well, I think in terms of education, and Waldorf stands on this principle of freedom, is that the state doesn't dictate what the curriculum is, nor do economic actors and for their interests dictate what the curriculum is. It's the teachers themselves have the freedom to create the curriculum based on their understanding of child development. So there's that freedom. But it's also the freedom within the curriculum. The curriculum needs to support the freedom of the student as well. And Steiner does that by suggesting that we become very careful with the notion of judgment, like I mentioned earlier. So to have an actual moral conscience, it has to be attained out of inner freedom. You can't impose a moral code on someone. And even though they may externally follow that moral code, they may not actually be a moral person. And under the right conditions, their lack of inner morality, a lack of a moral conscience, will surely show itself. Um, so the idea is that right in the pedagogical approach, you're cultivating this. You're not bringing a moral code, but you're cultivating the feeling sense of morality, um, and a sense of social responsibility. And you do that through helping the students cultivate their own sound judgment. So, and by sound judgment, what is meant is just not your own point of view. That your sense of morality arises out of looking at the diversity of points of view. That's what gives it its inherent moral nature. It's not just your opinion about things, but it's formulated soundly through diversity of point of view. And that's something, again, that's frowned upon because most other points of view, if I'm a critical social justice inspired teacher, I'm looking at most other points of view as inherently oppressive. so I'm not going to bring them. Really, just the point of view of egalitarianism is the only real um, non-oppressive point of view. So for the sake of my students, I'm going to bring that point of view. So that way of thinking works against the freedom of the individual. And
So
of
it's
course,
this sorry, go
the
on.
individual, it's, the individual, that brings us back to your original question of the postmodern approach, is this disenchantment with the Enlightenment and the notion of individuality itself. So you'll see postmodern socialism or postmodern social justice theory is embracing this idea that humans are basically social constructs. Our gender is a social construct. Our sense of relations between each other is based on social construct. I would say, to answer your question directly, I would say that in the kernel of this approach, this postmodern approach, is the idea that the human being is formed by external factors, external forces, not internal forces. This is and that's something that goes right back into Marxism. The idea that classes in society are simply historical products. And Noam Chomsky, who you may be familiar with the work of Noam Chomsky, he does a beautiful job of discrediting that point of view. Can I read a quote from him?
Please do.
I I've used this quote before, and just to get like right into your point of view, like so in let's say in socialistic or leftist thinking, there's two traditions. There's the tradition of Marxism and there's the tradition of anarchism. And when people asked Steiner, where do you see yourself politically, he said, well, I'm an individualist anarchist. So within those two traditions, he's siding with this idea of radical social change, but he's doing it within the anarchist tradition, which involves the decentralization of power. The Marxist tradition has a concentration of power in it. And one of the ways in which the Marxists operate is through this idea of that that human beings are historical constructs. And we see this in critical social justice theory as one of the founding tenets of it. So Chomsky, speaking within, you could call it there's different names, the anarchist movement, the sort of libertarian socialist. It's the part of the socialistic or leftist thinking that is more, you could say, liberatory, in that it wants to create a decentralized social form. So here's Chomsky. He says, and of course, Chomsky, we know, is a radical left-wing intellectual, right?
Yeah.
He says, I think it is a tragedy and a catastrophe that the left has accepted the idea of humans as historical products, simply reflections of their environments. Because what follows from that, of course, is that there is no moral barrier to molding them any way you like. If humans have no inner nature, if they don't have an inner instinct for freedom, that it is not fundamental to their nature to have free, productive, creative work under their own control, if that is not part of their nature, then there's no moral reason for allowing them that space. You can just mold them into being what you think they ought to be. So that way of thinking is kind of uh, is now reflected in this postmodern turn in its embrace of social constructionism. The idea gender is a social construct, race is a social construct. Most of what what is what forms humans is these external factors. And of course, Waldorf and anthroposophy brings the opposite point of view, that it's really inner forces that form the human being, not so much outer forces. So I hope that answers your question. It's a little
Yes.
long-winded.
No, fantastic. Yeah, it made me think of. I read this article just in the newspaper a couple of years ago in an English paper, and it was just saying this particular scientist said he'd proved that there is no such thing as the self.
Yeah.
So there is no self. There is no there is no agent, there is no agency for
Yeah.
each individual. And my next thought was, well, that if that's the case, and the government can, or whoever is in power can really mold human beings to do and say and think in any way they like, which is in a sense what's happening. I think that's the other side of it. If most people believe that, then this kind of way of educating children to not be able to find their own inner moral freedom leads to, or can lead to, them just going along with whatever the society or the government or whoever says they should go along with.
Yeah.
There's so much in that, isn't there? That this
Oh, yeah.
just that little bit there that we did. There's so much in that anthroposophy, in a sense, seeks to answer, or at least give a
Yeah.
path towards answering. Uh,
Yeah.
that our culture does not give us. There's nothing coming towards us from the media, from the modern intellectual world, from the
Yeah.
universities. It's disappearing, and
Yeah.
that's also, I think, the gift of Western culture in a way. One of the gifts of Western culture, that
Hmm.
um, this idea of the self, that there is a self, that there is content, the self has
Yeah.
content, and it's this
And that we
evolving.
can, I mean, one of the critical points of that point of view is that we're unable to uh, we're really products of our group identities, and we're unable to rise above the social conditioning of those group identities. So if that's the case, then I mean, and this is where the notion of individuality comes out, that then there's no point in cultivating a sense of inner freedom or moral conscience, because that'll just be that'll just be imbued with biases
It's
from
just
outside.
another social construct.
Yeah, it's like a social contract. So that explains why the de-emphasis on individuality and the idea that, like in this article around decolonization, to bring it back to that the idea is, well, we just have to get rid of this set of Western assumptions and we have to put new ones in, and essentially uh, enforce that through the state. So so
Mm,
so there's a real inherent assumption there that the state will enforce these new assumptions,
mm.
and people will be conditioned by them to act more uh, to act
Morally.
less oppressively and act morally,
There's
right? So
there's also a sort of a false assumption in there that bringing in this new ideology or whatever that's going to replace Western culture is benign. That it's just,
mhm,
that it doesn't lead to one thing or another. It's just, the middle ground or something. That's a trick.
yes.
I think it sounds like a trick.
Yeah, it's interesting that this point of view tends not to identify itself. Like you'll very rarely hear a critical social justice theorist or scholar refer to it as like postmodern socialism, which I think is a fair identifier. You'll rarely hear them talk about critical social justice theory, because they tend to drop the word critical and adopt it just as social justice, as if it's
Mm,
completely um, in tune with the social justice approach of Martin Luther King or others, the
mm.
universalization of rights. So they tend to drop that and just pick up the tradition, but it's actually quite a fundamental change. One of my thoughts is that part of the why this is such a strong lure for people is that there's an existential aspect of it. The idea that if we can simply socially construct a new set of assumptions, then we'll transform human nature. We will end the scourge of othering in the world. And I think there's a kind of in the kind of world we live in, which is more and more chaotic, there's a feeling of certainty in that. There's a feeling of grounded existential, okay, if we can just get this job done, we're going to profoundly change the world. And Steiner has a very, very different picture of that. If we do not transform social power, we'll end up just as in Orwell's point of view, right? that we can revolutionize it without things actually changing. And this, I could bring in the Lord of the Rings a little bit here, um, like we touched on at the beginning. And I think
Sorry,
Tolkien,
Mark. Just before you do
yeah,
that, I
yeah,
do want to go there because I really want to hear that.
okay,
I'm fascinated by this connection. Um, I just want to ask. It seems to me that there's a fundamental contradiction in this critical social theory, or however you critical. What did you? How did you?
critical
Uh,
social justice theory.
okay,
It's a
thanks.
mouthful, yeah.
It is a mouthful. Um, that there's a contradiction underneath it somehow. And I don't know if I can actually articulate this, but it's a little bit like um, it's about the individual to a degree, to some degree, but it only has the individual existing within groups. So I could, what makes me in this theory, what would make me an individual is that I belong to these distinct groups that are different from the distinct groups that you belong to. We might have a couple of crossovers. We might be both meat eaters or vegans or whatever. So we
Hmm.
belong to that group. It's like this sort of crazy Venn diagram with lots of
Yeah,
different lots of
yeah,
different circles. Um, but that is my individuality. My individuality is based on all the different groups that I belong to at once.
yeah.
And
It's
there
kind
seems
of
to be a contradiction
yeah,
there. But I don't know if I'm saying it right.
yeah. Your individuality is a sum of your group identities. There's
Right.
nothing else. There's nothing individual really about it. And it can be a unique picture of that what's making up that particular sum of identities, right? But the notion that that beyond that there's an individual that is able to, in a way, transcend or um, expand their individuality because there is something actually unique within their being that can be expanded. Um, that is seen as largely an illusion. Now, I think there's a spectrum of thinking on that, right? There's some, modern philosophers who will take up this idea that the self is an illusion, like you were saying, and there's others who say, well, there's just various aspects of human beings that are socially constructed. But it's a general way of thinking. I mean, what's common amongst in that spectrum of thinking is that those are the factors that ultimately determine our interactions with each other. And we can't really, we may be able to stop acting oppressively, but we actually can't necessarily be actors for transformation. It's only, and this comes back to the postmodernism, which is all about power. The question is who has the power? That's what's going to determine what the world looks like.
Oh
It
yeah,
can't be done
yeah.
cooperatively between people. It has to
Mm.
be done by um, who has power, which means that society has to be set up in a way that power is attainable. And this is Steiner's the radicalness of Steiner's point of view is that in social threefolding, no one has the power. It's a decentralized society, but it's also power is decentralized, but it's also differentiated between spheres
Mm.
that have to act cooperatively. That's the transformational aspect of it. And that's one of the reasons that I think, Noam Chomsky's tradition in the sort of anarchist tradition hasn't progressed um, far enough in a way because it only brings the decentralized aspect of that social thinking. What Steiner adds to it is both a decentralized impulse, but also a differentiation between the spheres. So if you look at the work of Chomsky, and I'm a big fan of this guy, Murray Bookchin, an American anarchist thinker. He came up with the idea of social ecology. If you look at both of them as real sort of uh, main figures of carrying on that anarchist tradition, you'll find that they don't what limits them is that they don't have a clear enough picture of how society's differentiated into three spheres. So when you add that in, um, that way of thinking, that kind of radical social change way of thinking becomes something that's much more viable and practical and much less abstract. That was one of
Mm,
Steiner's big critiques of the socialists, is they work for sort of an abstract model of scientific model of the social realm.
mm. Oh, that's
Anyway,
great.
so
Yeah,
lots of ideas. Yeah,
that no, that really helped me with my understanding of the threefolding to see the difference. Actually, yeah, that differentiation is radical in itself.
yeah.
Um, so there was one more point just before you get to, if we've got time. Have you got time? I've got.
I've got time. Yeah.
Okay. Um, just before we moved into bringing into connection with Tolkien, was it seems to me like it's all of this is like almost like an attack on Waldorf education or an attack on Steiner or an attack on childhood in a way, um, and on Western culture, the positive aspects of Western culture and the possible transformation thereof. Do you see it that way, that it is an attack? I mean, I'm not saying that these people like Martin Rawson are consciously out to destroy something. I don't know. I don't know that. I don't know what's going on in people's hearts and minds, but um, the outcome of it seems to be like an attack to undermine it, to sort of destroy it from within. What are your thoughts?
Well, yeah, I don't. I don't believe that kind of energy is behind it. It is a destructive kind of form. Certainly, um, a change in in what's going to guide it. The idea that anthroposophy, gave us Waldorf education in a certain form, and we now have to take it up and add new sources of thinking to it to make it modern and relevant, right? I think that's more the line of thinking.
Okay. Mm.
And I think a very, most teachers that I've met who kind of adhere to that point of view are very well-meaning. Like they're trying to act out of a moral impulse, right? And the problem is that within critical social justice theory, um, well, to have an approach to social justice, it's a combination of a moral impulse and an interpretation of the root causes of the problem. So you combine those two, this desire to act on this impulse of the principle of justice, but to do it in a way that's not just a single issue, but looks at society and whole as a whole. You have to have an interpretation of what are the root causes of these things.
Mhm.
Now, the problem with social justice theory, as it stands now, critical social justice theory, is that it combines those two things into one system. So any critique or questioning of the social theory a uh, it becomes interpreted as violating the moral principle because you can't separate the two. So, for example, if I say, well, actually, I don't think gender is a social construct. That's interpret not that that's interpreted as an immoral statement or an unjust thing to say because the gender theory and the principle of justice are melded together. They can't be separated out in that system. So one of the tasks, I think, of an anthroposophical approach is to separate those two things out and see this is actually the notion that gender is a social construct is a social theory. It may make sense to you, and you're completely free in the cultural realm to embrace any social theory that you want. But um, there's a problem if they can't be separated. If I say I don't think gender is a social construct, I don't mean that in any way in just any kind of discriminatory way against people who have a different gender experience. I'm just saying the root cause of it in human nature is I look at it differently. So the fact that you can't do that is one of the core problems. You're and it's a very clever way. If you go back to the early French intellectuals who came up with this whole postmodern way of thinking, they're for me, they're characterized by a real lack of morality combined with a very, very high level of intelligence. So it's an incredibly intelligent thing to do to marry your moral principle with your theory because it guarantees that your theory will never be questioned.
Mm.
So it's an inherent, I would even call it an inherent authoritarianism that you're unwilling to look objectively at the social theories you're following and actually hold the idea that there may be still something to learn in that realm. And yeah,
Okay, and it's a great way to gain power as well, isn't it? Or to
it's
become
a path.
powerful.
And then that's coming back to the notion of revolutionizing social power. Part of the impulse towards revolutionizing power is to obtain power, the power
Mm.
of the state to enforce your moral codes on on anyone that doesn't follow them. And really, in social threefolding, the role of the state is shrunk down
Mm.
considerably, right? So it's not a very attractive mechanism anymore for that way, um, for that, sort of Marxist, more related authoritarian socialism is not interested in reducing the power of the state. They're quite
Yeah.
interested in obtaining the power of the state and magnifying the power of the state, because that's the only real mechanism they have. And philosophically, they're tied to the idea that our whole society has to be based on rights and egalitarianism, which brings us into a little point in the article too, that Steiner's vision is that you have to balance individuality and communitarian values. And this postmodern way of thinking is the idea that you have to wipe out the antisocial forces or the individualist forces. You're not balancing, you're wiping them out. And you have this vision of social forces everywhere, egalitarian social forces. Now, the problem with that, as Steiner points out over and over again, is that you cannot eliminate the individualist forces. They will simply go underground and become darker forces. And again, Orwell portrays this beautifully in 1984 when Big Brother emerges. There's this suppression of individuality, but it emerges in a dark form in a new way. And it's like the pigs in Animal Farm. They quickly adopt the individuality of the farmer, um, and become a very regressive force in that story. So
Mm.
there's some, I would say, like in general, this whole point of view is leading us in. I would say that the theories are on the surface have a lot of attraction, but underneath they're actually regressive social theories from an anthroposophical point of view. It sounds great, like
Yeah.
egalitarianism everywhere. It sounds like something it's easy to get behind, right?
Yeah.
This is
Sounds
unequal
nice.
and that is unequal, but it's still low resolution. And unless we embrace a higher resolution picture, we're not going to address social justice issues both appropriately and fundamentally and radically.
I just want to say one thing about that as well. It's not just state power that it leads to either now, because of now with all the supranational aspect of things, the World Health Organization or whoever it is,
Mm.
these supranational things
Yeah,
can
yeah,
gain power over bigger populations too.
yes.
Yeah, but please tell me about this connection with the Lord of the Rings, and
The Lord of the Rings,
but
yeah.
and I'd love to hear about your book, and also just with the article, just so I don't forget the article that you mentioned and your book. I'll link everything in the description below so that people can find their way
Okay,
to that.
great, yeah.
So yeah, let's
Yeah.
hear about it.
So in a nutshell, so what's what's the connection between Tolkien and anthroposophy? Um, so those of you who are real uh, big fans of Tolkien, you'll know that the prequel to the Lord of the Rings was the Silmarillion, which is the first and second ages of Middle Earth. Actually, the first, second, and third ages of Middle Earth. And the Lord of the Rings story is just the transition from the third age to the fourth age. So when Tolkien was writing, uh, so right after World War One, he begins writing the early stories of the first age of Middle Earth. And he eventually, he spent his whole life forming those stories, and they were unpublished by the time he died. So The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings arose in a way out of projects that out of smaller projects, if you will, out of a larger project. And what we can see is that Tolkien was actually influenced by the work of Owen Barfield, he was together with in the Inklings in Oxford as an academic group of professors. And we're going to, show this connection in the book where Barfield's understanding of the evolution of language was became a real interest of Tolkien's. And one Tolkien scholar followed that lead really closely and found out that the Silmarillion is basically structured around Barfield's idea of the evolution of language and consciousness. So Tolkien was working with, you could say, he was working with a kind of anthroposophical vision of the development of language. Now, Barfield spent an evening with the Inklings explaining anthroposophy, and he said he didn't really make a lot of headway or conversion. So it's not like Tolkien was consciously trying to do that, but he was very influenced by Barfield's thinking. So anthroposophy, in a way, what I try to show is that in the imagery in The Lord of the Rings, we see Tolkien working out the implications of what he had written in the Silmarillion. He's like following it through to its logical conclusion in a way. Um, so there's that. And uh, so this notion of power. So you could say that The Lord of the Rings is kind of a meditation on the nature of power. That's one lens you could look at it through. Power, both um, at an individual level and at a group level or a social level, is one of the themes that's being worked out through the whole mythology. So, so in the dramatic story of The Lord of the Rings, you have this tension between using the ring or destroying the ring. And what I began to see in that was when people are tempted to use the ring, it's for virtuous reasons. They want to use that power to fix a problem, to stop a war, to defeat an enemy, to defend their people, right? To stop evil, etc. But of course, what Tolkien is telling us is that when you use the ring, your shadow side is amplified. So the nature of power just expands in a pathological direction. But if you do this, the more sort of sacrificial path of destroying the ring, of resisting what seems like a virtuous power applied to wonderful ends, if you resist that and you transform the ring through its destruction, then a new balance, a new healthy arrangement is obtained. So I think that's what Tolkien is doing, is he's showing us that revolutionary power has doesn't deal with the actual core of evil. And this sacrificial destruction or transformation of power is what brings about a more harmonious arrangement. Um, so that theme, I think, plays out pretty strongly. And I think really it's being played out, I see it as being played out in critical social justice theories, a little bit like saying use the ring. And
Right.
and a more threefolding approach is saying, so using the ring is like would be equivalent to using rights to transform the cultural realm, or using rights to transform or revolutionize, I should say, the cultural realm, or revolutionize the economic realm.
Could you just
Um,
give us a practical example of what that might look like? We've kind of done it already, but just so because sometimes when I hear about threefolding, I don't quite get it until I hear it landed in an
so
example.
sorry, an example of the domination of one sphere over another.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So, um, so well, let's say in neoliberalism. So we currently live in a world, like if you look at the left and right, the right is uh, works in the operation, or works in under a system of thinking that's determined by neoliberalism, which is the idea that the economy should dominate the state, that the economic priorities of privately owned capital, the state should be the servant of that rather than a separate power. That's kind of the neoliberal chaos we live with now. And in the socialist tradition, the idea was that the state would transform the economy through the destruction of private property and the elevation of workers' rights into an equal level, or everyone in society brought to an equal economic level. Um, in order to do that, uh, so in order for neoliberalism to dominate the state, they have to erode rights of people
Mm.
so that their power grows. And for, like, let's say the Bolshevik state to dominate the economy, they have to concentrate power in the state to do that. So fraternal organizations that have a more distributed social power. So if you look at the picture of the Russian Revolution, which is fascinating, you have workers' councils, you have Soviets, you have factory committees that sprung up almost organically during the Russian Revolution. All of those social forms were destroyed by the Bolsheviks, sometimes violently, because they had to concentrate power in the state in order to create this, what they saw as a new level of egalitarianism. So that's what causes the social pathologies
Right.
to result,
Mm.
because it doesn't understand why injustice is happening in the it has an inkling of it. It's not completely like the notion of private ownership of capital is problematic, and Steiner addresses that by in the economic realm by putting the ownership of the means of production at the community level, not at the state level, or not privatized. So it's a very creative way of thinking about it. So that's the idea that one sphere would dominate the other out of virtue, of course, out of the idea that they want to solve a problem.
Yeah.
But
Right.
the assumptions about of what makes up that sphere are not accurate. They're at a low resolution level, and Steiner helps us understand that by bringing a higher resolution. And I would also say a non-ideological picture. He takes out political ideology and he looks right into the practical activity in each realm to determine what health looks like in that realm. Does that make sense?
Okay, yes, it does. Yeah, we could almost do a whole nother podcast
Oh, we
on
could.
just on
Oh, we
threefolding, couldn't
could.
we? Because that's
Yeah,
yeah, I'm understanding it a
we're
lot
touching
more
the
after
surface.
today. Yeah, we're just doing the surface, but that's good.
Yeah.
It'll
Well, in
start somewhere.
anthroposophy, what we've done is this is part of the reason we don't have a social justice theory, because we have threefolding and we have this image of social health that the anthroposophical movement has been working with. But unless we understand the symptoms of ill health and how that threefolding and the ideal of each form is actually a mechanism, so like a key to health in that realm, we're not going to have a lot to contribute to the conversation around social injustice. And I think we have immense amounts to contribute, which
Absolutely.
is why I get a little peeved off at the current, Waldorf scholarship around these issues, which completely dismisses it without. And even, one of the things that Martin did that bothered me a lot was it kind of painting Steiner as a bit of a socialist, and then ignoring the volumes of work that Steiner did towards helping us understand the limitations of that point of view.
He could be
It's just,
characterized as a socialist, but then also the opposite sometimes as well as a
yeah,
you know,
there's
so
socialistic elements in it because he wants to balance the social forces. You could say he wants to balance socialism with individualism in a certain way. Individualism is the critical social justice theory tends to look at individualism only in its shadow side, which is egotism. They don't see the nature of the individual in a positive light. It's mostly cast as the egotistic shadow of
mm,
individualism. So that's a fundamental problem too, because Steiner sees human evolution as the growing strength of individuality. over time, which is fundamentally rejected by critical social justice theory and the Waldorf academics who are moving us in that direction. They have to downplay individuality to be in alignment with that. And Steiner's saying it's only getting stronger. So the key to social health is balancing that strengthening individuality with social forms between social impulses and individualists. It's in the balance of them that social health is reached, not in the downplaying of individuality.
Oh, that's beautifully
We're
said.
touching on a lot of different topics, Mick.
No, it's great. It's great. I just the image of the ring just arose from me again as you said that, and it's a little bit like the ring could be seen as that um the the egotism take the individuality sort of like as Steiner describes or from the in the book of Revelations, the I am is a two-edged sword, the I, and this individuality can turn in on itself and become egotistical, or it can do the opposite and become a part of the community, but while keeping the individual.
And that's the
So
shadow side. So if you ask yourself the question, how does injustice manifest in the cultural realm? It's really in what I would call, in the Jungian sense, the projection of shadow. So because the shadow of our individuality is egotism. And then, so that's at an individual level. At a collective level, the projection of a collective shadow is, for me, should be the real focus of social justice issues in the cultural realm. How do we educate children to have this free moral conscience? So the benefit of the free moral conscience is that you don't fall into this projection of shadow. So racism is the collective. Um, it's a collective shadow. So we saw the Nazis had to do this, right? Over time, they had to build up this image of Jewish people um, into a particular picture, so that the collective shadow of their culture could begin to see them as the problem and not their own shadow side. So this notion of individual and collective shadow, for me, is the meat that we have to chew on to make progress with justice in the cultural realm. You can't live in freedom as a Black person or as a transgender person or whatever identity you choose for yourself. You'll face discrimination to the extent that we're caught in the projection of our shadow. Bringing rights into that realm, you can't legislate that. You can't make it a law that I can't project my shadow. Now, I can't do it in a way, I can't do it overtly because I'll be breaking the law. But if anything, if I'm really connected to that shadow projection, it's going to push me over to the far right, to another extreme where there are people who want to fight back against that. And that's what we're kind of seeing, right? This polarization. So we don't want to bring rights into that, because we just suppress the thing that needs to be transformed, which is our ability to allow people to live in freedom the way they choose.
well, I think that's a beautiful thought to end on, the freedom that the individual chooses. And yeah, there's so much more we could get into, but Mark, I just want to say
Yeah,
a big thank you to agreeing to have this conversation with me today. As I mentioned earlier, I'll have links to your book and the article, etc., in the description below. But really appreciate this conversation today. I
you're
think it
welcome. You're
enlightened
welcome, Mick.
a lot of things for me. Just before I finish up, just want to let people
Yep.
know who are watching that if they would like to support this podcast so that I can keep interviewing these very interesting people. Um, there's some links in below as well for the where you can support on Substack and buy me a coffee, that kind of thing, and also a link to a video series that I've got and an online community and all that sort of stuff. So yeah, please do support us that way. But Mark, thank you very much once again, and look forward to speaking with you soon.
Yeah, thank you, Mick. And you can pop in my email there too if people are interested in talks or workshops on some of this content, or even on the Tolkien content, I'm more than happy to. I really love doing that as a teacher. It helps me feel like a teacher again,
Okay,
which
great.
I
Yeah,
love.
but
But
very happy to do
thanks so
that.
much.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Take care. Bye
Bye
bye.
for now.